When stress, late nights, and daily routines make it hard to unwind, your skin can feel it. Now there's a better way to care for your skin overnight with Osea's new Dream Bioretinol Body Serum. A dreamy bedtime body serum powered by bioretinol and red seaweed to visibly firm and smooth, while soothing magnesium and lavender helps promote a sense of serenity. Give your skin a rest with Osea. And right now, get 10% off your first order site-wide with code DREAMY at OseaMalibu.com or find Osea at Ulta.
Ovation Hall at Ocean Casino Resort in Atlantic City is the ultimate stage for world-class entertainment. An intimate venue with the best energy, state-of-the-art sound, and views that never miss. From top performers to A-list comedians and legendary acts, these are the shows you don't want to miss. Let the music take over. Go for the laughs that keep you coming back. Go for the nights you'll never forget. Visit theoceanac.com to view the complete entertainment lineup at Ocean Casino Resort in Atlantic City. Go to Ocean. Go for the win.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I am delighted today to be joined by Sofía Robleda, who is here to talk about her book, The Other Moctezuma Girls, a story of the kind of violent period of conquest of Mexico and the fate of indigenous peoples, and the story really of survival of one of the kind of indigenous royalty that survives through this really kind of brutal moment, and I guess some of the things that kind of tells us and shows us about indigenous struggles and colonialism and a range of other things, no doubt. But firstly, Sofía, welcome. It's lovely to have you today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone who's listening. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay. So firstly, let's talk about the book. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so The Other Moctezuma Girls, it's a historical fiction novel based mostly on the life of Isabel Moctezuma, who was the primary daughter of Emperor Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, who was the emperor of the Mexica, the Aztecs, at the time when Hernán Cortés arrived. And it's kind of 2 points of view. The book details kind of some chapters of her life, but the main kind of book is her daughters kind of trying to find these chapters. So they go around the Valley of Mexico in kind of an adventure type quest to find their mother's story and piece together her, all the truths that she kept hidden in order to survive the Spanish conquest. So it's kind of an adventure, historical adventure, and like a fictional memoir, but it's based on the story of Isabel Moctezuma. Yeah.
What do we know about Isabel?
Well, Isabel was born with the name Tecuichpoch. She, like I said, she was the primary daughter of the Emperor Moctezuma at the time that the Spanish arrived. There's not much that is known about her life except that she was married 6 times, including to Emperor Cuauhtemoc, who was the last Aztec emperor. And so she, by de facto, was the last Aztec empress.
Right.
She survived the Spanish conquest. She survived the siege of Tenochtitlan, the 3 month siege. She survived the smallpox epidemic that decimated 90% of the population. And then she maneuvered herself to become the wealthiest landowner of New Spain. By the time of her death, she was kind of known as the Lady of Tacuba, and she had the largest encomienda in the Valley of Mexico. Encomienda is like the land and tribute grants that were awarded by the Spanish crown. So she sued the Spanish crown to kind of get as much land back as she could. Um, She had 7 children, so she survived 7 births,
Hmm.
including a child with Hernan Cortés. So that was her illegitimate child that she had with Hernan Cortés. And yeah, her kind of last the main thing that we know about her, it comes from her last will and testament, where she emancipated hundreds, if not thousands, of her slaves, which was quite a big, remarkable deal at the time. So it was quite commented upon that she had done this.
Mm.
So, it's just an astounding story of this queen that no one really knows about, including myself as a Mexican person. You know a lot about Moctezuma, you know a lot about Cuauhtemoc. Everyone knows those names in Mexico, and
Yeah.
but her, I had no idea about her. So this was kind of, for me, it was imperative, I suppose, to write this story. Um, I just couldn't. She wouldn't leave me alone.
It sounds like there is some interesting, kind of fascinating sort of aspects of her interactions with the Spanish crown.
Mhm.
So when she became Empress, was that sort of essentially she was a kind of like an indigenous but local kind of potentate who was answerable to the King of Spain? Is that sort of kind of how it
No,
was?
no. So she didn't become empress under the Emperor of Spain. So the Aztecs, the Mexica, had their own
Yeah.
emperor. So there was a Mexica Empire. It stretched from, the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and her
Hmm.
father was emperor under his own right. So his title was Wait
Hmm.
and so she the crown, I suppose, for lack of a better word, used to pass from, like, not so much to the children. It used to pass to, like, other siblings, for example. So after Moctezuma, his brother Cuitlahuac became Huaytlahuac. He married Isabel Moctezuma.
Hmm.
So she was like kind of the she had a really strong claim to become the primary wife of the
Sure.
Huaytlahuac, because she had kind of both lines of, like, the biggest royal lines uh, of the nobility of the Aztecs, right?
Hmm.
So everyone wanted her to be their wife. And after Cuitlahuac died from the smallpox plague, then her cousin Cuauhtemoc said, "Oh, I'm going to marry her," because she was still, alive, and she
Okay.
was still like the primary kind of prized bride.
Hmm.
And then after Cuauhtemoc was defeated, she obviously lost her title. She wasn't the empress anymore. But she was still given a lot of privileges, because the Spanish did recognize the natural lords of the land. So they wanted
Right.
to marry into the nobility in order to kind of strengthen their claims to the land. And so there was a different approach, I guess, than the British took
Hmm.
when they kind of came to colonize. The Spanish were very much like, we're going to mix everybody together, forcefully or not. And so they did take on a lot of indigenous brides, especially
Okay.
those who had titles, so that they could then kind of become more
Hmm.
like have legitimate claims to the land through their wives.
And I suppose if your empire is on the other side of the Atlantic, being able to say, well, hold on a moment, we married into this bloodline, such and such a conquistador married into this bloodline. This land, this territory has come to me by your customs. Obviously, the way in which the Aztec are defeated is extremely violent, and obviously there is the huge factor of smallpox. But I suppose part of the kind of the thinking of holding on to the empire in the long term must have been around this process of trying to find ways of legitimizing and
Yes.
legitimating. Um, and the I mean, was there I mean, obviously there is this kind of intermarrying, but was there a sense of kind of Europe white maintaining looking to maintain white European superiority or
So there's this is a really so the society, like for the Mexica, for example, and many other Mesoamerican societies, they were already highly stratified. So you had your nobility, you had your, I guess, lower working class, and you had your slave class. That
yeah.
was already kind of quite prominent. So the Spanish did kind of position themselves at the top.
Mm.
So you would get, and there's these really interesting cast paintings. So they had names for all the different types of blood mixes, right? So if if a Spaniard married an indigenous woman or had a child with her, then the child would be a mestizo. And then if the mestizo would marry a Spanish, then it would be a castizo. And then like so,
And
and
you
then
could wake
obviously.
you could go back up the racial hierarchy if you
You could go back up, but obviously the top of the top were the Spanish-born Spaniards, so the peninsulares, I think that's
yeah.
what they call them. Um, so and then we even have like a third stream of genes, which are from Africa. So the African Moors and people from Africa came with the very first Spanish people, sometimes as slaves, sometimes as free people, and they also mixed into the population. But if you look at, there's this really interesting set of paintings from the 17th century called the Casta paintings, and they like basically go like mix by mix, who is at the top, who is at the bottom, and you can see like the darker someone's skin is, the more kind of lower
Yeah.
class they are. So it did become a very colored colorism, a society based on colorism, stratified by color.
Mm.
Which in some ways still continues. There's still a lot of inequality
Sure.
for people who are more racialized in Mexican society. But the Spanish did intermingle, and 80% of Mexicans today have a combination of Spanish and indigenous ancestry.
Sure.
And so it was a very but for example, I'll tell you one more thing that is really interesting. The center of Tenochtitlan, right? They called it the Traza. So
Mm.
Tenochtitlan was now known as Mexico City, but back then it was Tenochtitlan. It was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and it was a city built in a lake, a beautiful city. So the center of the city was designated as, only kind of a pure Spanish could live in that center of the city after they came. Yeah.
Hmm.
So it was very much like, yes, we're here, we're intermingling, but we are the lords now.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned Britain. Um, and yeah, the kind of in most of the British Empire that kind of intermarrying is a real rarity. It does happen a little bit, but it's not on the scale that you mentioned there. But the British encountered in India a kind of a stratified society that they really took advantage of. And it really, just in much the same way, it worked to their purposes, and they, manipulated princely estates against one another. But the caste system, they, if anything, kind of helped to amplify. And it's fascinating, kind of darkly fascinating, I guess, when you find colonizers coming to understand useful bits about the societies that they are going to exploit,
100%.
and then working on that, and then sometimes finding local allies, saying, would you like to be richer? Would you like to defeat those guys over there? Because there are divisions in this society. And wherever you look with British, Spanish, French, Dutch, Belgian colonialism, European colonialism, it always functions on a kind of divide and rule. So there's always
Uh-huh.
somebody somewhere that's kind of done their homework a little bit.
Yeah, well, sorry.
No, you carry on. You carry on.
So and that's exactly what the Spanish did. It was extremely successful divide and conquer approach. And Cortés also got extraordinarily lucky, and I mean like so lucky because when he landed in Yucatan from Cuba, obviously there was already a colony established in Cuba,
Hmm.
which was known as Hispaniola back then. There had been some shipwrecked Spaniards from Cuba that had landed in Yucatan. Two survived. Jerónimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero, these Spanish men, became integrated into the Mayan community. Jerónimo de Aguilar knew Yucatec Maya. And at the same time, there was a young girl, 17, 18-year-old girl called Malintzin, who had been sold as a slave from the Mexica Empire to the Mayans. So she knew Nahuatl and she knew Maya. And so what happened was that Cortés found Jerónimo de Aguilar, and he was gifted Malinche, this girl, and so there he ended up kind of being able to have a translator. So he would speak in Castilian to Jerónimo de Aguilar. Jerónimo de Aguilar would speak in Maya to Malinche. Malinche would speak in Nahuatl. And at some point, Malinche learned Castilian, so she, made Jerónimo de Aguilar completely useless. But she knew the deep divisions that existed
Right.
in the Mexica Empire. She knew that there were lots of different Nahuatl-speaking people that didn't get along, that did not like the Mexica being on top, that didn't appreciate all the tribute that was flowing into the land. And she explained this to Cortés. So he had thousands and thousands of indigenous allies by the time he reached Tenochtitlan, including the Tlaxcalteca, who were the Mexica's worst enemies.
Yeah.
So, there was huge, they were not by themselves here. And I think this is something that people forget that the Spanish didn't do this on their own. And the people were not like one people that were all happily live coexisting together. There were
No.
deep cultural divisions. Um, so that was definitely the approach. And Cortés said of this girl, I will say, he said Malinche was second only to God in importance in his success in the Spanish conquest because of how much she understood. And she played her hard choices very well because she was a slave and she ended up being part of the higher echelons of New Spain society. She became basically essentially a Spanish noblewoman by the
Yeah.
time the conquest ended. So, the people were just trying to maybe do the best that they could with the really awful choices that were presented with.
Well, this is
We all prefer things a certain way, like groceries. If you want groceries just how you like them, you gotta try Instacart. They have a new preference picker that lets you pick how ripe or unripe you want your bananas. Shoppers can see your preferences upfront, helping guide their choices. Because when it comes to groceries, the details matter. Instacart. Get groceries just how you like.
for the most part what I think what happens with human beings. They are presented with in extremely desperate and brutal circumstances, and as I said, they do what they do. There are lots of interesting parallels. I won't sort of sidetrack us too much, but there are lots of interesting parallels with the story of Jamestown and Pocahontas and the interactions that the English have in the colonies in New England in North America, and how the divisions between the tribes, the Native American tribes there, and the interactions and the feuds between those tribes and alliances between them are exploited by the English. And there were moments where it was entirely possible. I mean, Jamestown does fail, but it's entirely possible that English colonization in North America would have failed. But actually having those sorts of interactions through, again, a Native American girl, often provide, crucial crucial bits of information and interactions. Hernan Cortés is one of the key characters in all of this. I was reading a book not about him, but about the history of debt, and he features in it, and about what the kind of man that he seems to be. Obviously, a lot of the conquistadors, when beginning with Columbus, but later on, when they arrive in the Americas, arrive saddled with debt, and they've got to pay their men, and they've got to pay back loans, and the loans for the ships and all these kinds of things, and they're really quite desperate to find gold. And he seems like a miserable guy, from my reading of him. But what's
He
your
was never
understanding of him?
happy.
No.
No, he was so, I think he's one of the uh, he was just mad with greed. And we used to spend so much money, even after even after he'd, quote unquote, been successful in the conquest. He always wanted more. Even after the king made him, he gave him a title, Marquis. He made him a Marquis. It was not enough. He was still building ships. He wanted to go to and try and kind of explore the spice trade, try and get ships going to Manila, spending a fortune and fortune and fortune all the time in kind of um uh in debting, in how do you say it? Like putting himself into more debt.
Yeah.
And my he always felt like hard done by,
Mm.
by the Emperor Charles V. He wanted to be viceroy, but he wasn't made viceroy, and so he wasn't happy about that.
No.
He always said, "Oh, I gave Charles V more cities, more countries than he ever had, like cities from his ancestors, and I basically got nothing in return." So he died very kind of bit embittered, very unhappy. Um, and yeah, he was just constantly always just looking for more. I think he said himself he has a sickness called avarice, and there's nothing he can do about it. So he recognized that he was just gluttonous for greed and for more and for wealth and everything, just more and more and more. Um, and I think like a lot of people were coming to the new world, I suppose, for lack of a better word, to look for opportunities to enrich themselves. They were fortune hunters. They were. I mean, Cortés had some training, I believe, in the law, so he was
Mm.
quite well versed in the Spanish law. Um, and obviously he was extremely clever. But a lot of the Spanish, yeah, conquistadors, they were just trying to to make it big. They were like in a gold rush, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a lot of kind of a free for all. And even though the Spanish crown were trying to put systems in place to prevent, quote unquote, the um, mistreatment of the indigenous population. They had the Council of the Indies, they had the laws of Burgos, they had lots of like laws in place trying to kind of
Mm.
keep the indigenous people who were considered Spanish subjects, to keep them from being exploited. The obviously application of this from the other side of the Atlantic was very poor, and the Spanish just did what they wanted
Yeah.
for a very, very long time.
Yeah. There's a really interesting part of the book, um, Imagined Communities, by the historian Benedict Anderson, and he talks about the periphery and the metropole when it comes to the early modern empires, and he talks about how citizenship was extended to the Americas. So you were not so much citizenship, but subjectship. You were a subject of the Crown of Spain, and about how in Spain, in the kind of the imperial, the heart of the empire, the people at the periphery, even the kind of the Europeans, the conquistadors, because they'd gone over there, they started to be seen in the kind of the court of the king and in the government and things like that as being, well, sort of notionally Spanish, but kind of they've gone over the seas, they've gone a bit native, and there things happen over there that we don't really understand because it's a long, long way away. So yes, they are Spanish, but not exactly. They're sort of a slightly kind of weirder and maybe a less palatable version of that. And I find it fascinating that when people think about who are we, who are like us, who are part of our tribe, well, they are, but not completely, And they were, and this mentality, it wasn't even that they were thinking about the indigenous peoples. They were thinking about people that also saw themselves as being Spanish. And again, if you look at the time of the American Revolution in the colonies, lots of the American revolutionaries, people like Jefferson and Washington and things like that, would initially have referred to themselves as Englishmen and said, well, we are Englishmen, but we don't have the kind of the traditional rights. There's no parliament, and we don't have, we're not treated like Englishmen. And it fascinates me how cultures on other sides of the Atlantic Ocean in this time of sail ships, these ideas of who we are and identity start to fray and change. But anyway, bit of a rambling aside there.
Yeah, no, but that's true. I mean, the Spanish were, we were under Spanish rule for 300 years. By the time of the Mexican independence, the War of Independence, people did feel like they had a very different identity to Spanish-born Spaniards versus Mexican-born Spaniards, I suppose. And that was, kind of there was a lot of resentment for the different treatment that people had depending on where you were born. But obviously that was like 300 years of to kind of collate a new identity and yeah, and kind of but even from the beginning there started to be an intermingling
Yeah.
of cultures. So yeah, I mean it is a side note, but it definitely was something that became a thorn for Mexican-born Spaniards. Not like when by the time that Mexico was starting to be thought of as a place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the kind of the essentially that the plunder of the Aztec Empire, historically, when you look at what that led to on a global level, it's really quite kind of a huge significance because not just Mexico, but the rest of South America, when it's looted of its gold, basically, the
And
gold
silver.
flows back into Europe. And actually, what that buys is eventually in the kind of 17th, 18th, and then eventually 19th, it all runs out in the 19th century, is this enormous flow of trade from Asia to Europe. When when Europeans wanted silk and tea from China, for example, they went with gold basically stolen from the Americas. And when you get to the late 19th, the late 18th, early 19th centuries, that all begins to run out. And Europeans try to say to the Chinese, oh, well, look, would you like some of our manufactured stuff? And the Qing Emperor of China says, no, we make all our things here, much like now, we're experiencing now. We don't need your stuff. And there was throughout the 19th century, there's this constant search for more gold. They find it in South Africa, they find it in California. There's never anywhere near as much as they found in the Americas. And the British solved the problem by importing huge amounts of opium into China and having a war. But the actual the actual use of the stolen gold, it didn't just sit in safes. It stimulated this huge circle of trade, and living standards in Europe in the kind of 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries shoot up because you can have all ultimately this extremely cheap stuff, which is nice things like spices and tea and silk and all this other lovely stuff, stimulate economies because you've got the thing that you need to buy it with, which is gold you stole from somewhere else.
Yeah, I think the amount of silver that flowed in from Mexico, because I mean, silver, they found enormous deposits of silver in Mexico, and I think it created some like massive problems with inflation at first
Yeah.
in the 16th century and debt.
Yeah.
So,
Now,
it's just like, what do we do with all of this surplus? But yeah, it was, and interestingly enough, the daughter of Isabel Moctezuma, she was married, the daughter that she had with Hernan Cortés, she married the man who discovered the silver mines in
right.
Zacatecas, the huge, huge silver mines. And that was basically his reward for his discovery was this this very well-bred daughter of both Moctezuma and Hernan Cortés. Um, so that's another kind of link there. Interesting how these kind of
Yeah.
families were in the middle of all of these huge world kind of events.
Yeah. And often probably how they survived.
Mm.
So, we must finish in a moment, but let's talk about the book. So the Other Moctezuma Girls is currently available in all good bookshops.
So it's coming out next week. So it's actually,
Sweet.
yeah, it will be available from next week, and it will be available in the States and in the
Oh, great.
UK. So, I hope everyone finds themselves a little copy and leave
Sure.
a comment if you like it.
Sure. And I will put if I can find a pre-order link somewhere, I'll put that in the chat, the show notes below. As we always say on the podcast, if you can buy it from an independent book retailer, please do.
Yes.
If you can't, buy it directly from the publisher because the big online retailers have enough money and we must support the infrastructure of little bookshops because
Yes.
that's how
Yes.
without those guys we don't get authors, we don't get books.
That's right. Yes.
Well, Sophia, it was really lovely to chat with you today. And I do hope perhaps things like Mexico, I cover much less of than I'd like to on this podcast. So perhaps if you'd like to come back in the future and talk about Mexico and
Oh,
conquistadors and anything else, then you'd be very welcome.
oh, thank you so much. Absolutely. I love talking about this. I feel like I don't get enough people asking me, so I'm always really enjoying, the time that I get to talk to people who are interested. And I'll be would be very happy. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll leave you there, but take very good care, and it was lovely to chat with you today.
You too. Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.